To think you know Henry VIII? The guy with 6 wives, the founder of the Church of England? Well, buckle up, because the man history textbooks sanitize is a grotesque shadow of the real Henry VIII. This was a king whose body was a walking disaster. A monarch so consumed by his own physical and mental decay that he became a living nightmare for his entire court. Forget the portrait of the dashing, red-haired young man on a horse. The real Henry was so grotesquely obese that he needed mechanical devices just to move around. A man whose rotting leg wounds smelled so horrific that his servants would literally run away, gagging. His life was a slow, agonizing descent into a madness fueled by pain, paranoia, and an insatiable appetite. And the final chapter? A final, bizarre act of chaos from his corpse, so shocking that his coffin literally exploded from the gases of his decomposing body. A final, undignified end for a man who claimed divine right. You're about to discover the shocking curiosities about Henry VIII that make Game of Thrones look like a children's fairy tale. From his bizarre eating rituals to his paranoid security measures, from his treatment of wives that went far beyond mere execution to the grotesque reality of his final years. These are the facts that will change everything you thought you knew about England's most infamous king. Let's start with the most shocking truth. By the end of his life, Henry VIII was a living corpse, his body so consumed by a catalog of afflictions that it was a constant source of trauma for everyone around him. His decline was not a gradual fading, but a violent collapse. By the 1540s, the man who had once been the very image of a Renaissance prince, athletic, imposing, and full of life, was a monstrous caricature. His waist measured 54 inches. To put that in perspective, that's wider than many people are tall. His weight swelled to around 400 pounds, a staggering mass in an era when the average man weighed barely 140 pounds. The sheer effort of carrying this bulk was a constant strain on his heart and joints. But his corpulence was just the beginning of the horror story. His legs were a living nightmare, covered in massive, festering ulcers that never healed. These were not small cuts or abrasions. We're talking about open, oozing wounds that continuously leaked pus and rotting flesh. Historical accounts from the time are filled with visceral descriptions of the constant pain and the overwhelming stench that emanated from the king. It was a smell so putrid, so foul, that it permeated the palace and was reportedly detectable from several rooms away. Courtiers, hardened by the realities of medieval life, would discreetly hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces when approaching the king, their expressions carefully masked to avoid revealing their disgust. Servants, whose duty it was to tend to the king's wounds, were in a constant state of dread. The task was so universally loathed that they would draw straws to determine who had to get close to the king's legs, viewing it as a form of punishment, a daily ordeal of unspeakable horror. To be assigned to Henry's personal service was to be sentenced to a close-up encounter with a decaying human being. But this physical decay was a symptom of something deeper. Modern medical historians believe the cause was not just gluttony, but a severe traumatic brain injury from a jousting accident in 1536. Henry, who loved the sport, suffered a fall so catastrophic that he was rendered unconscious for 2 hours. In the brutal world of the 16th century, a 2-hour coma was a death sentence. While he survived, the injury likely caused a massive personality shift, transforming him from the charismatic, relatively stable king of his youth into the paranoid, rage-filled monster of his later years. The brain injury, combined with his lifestyle, likely triggered a cascade of health problems. Many medical experts now suspect he suffered from Cushing's syndrome, a disorder that would perfectly explain his dramatic weight gain, the extreme mood swings, and the horrific non-healing leg ulcers. His doctors, meanwhile, were so terrified of the king's volatile temper that they would never dare to suggest he was seriously ill. Criticizing the king's health was considered a form of treason. You could be executed for implying the king wasn't perfectly whole. In his final years, the man who claimed divine right to rule England couldn't even control his own bowel movements. Royal attendants had to carry special chairs everywhere he went, because Henry could barely make it from room to room without having an accident. This is the same man who executed people for looking at him the wrong way. A king whose power and arrogance were so absolute, yet who had become a complete and utter slave to his own failing body. The wives had it even worse than you think. Everyone knows Henry VIII had 6 wives and executed 2 of them. But the reality of what those women endured goes far beyond a simple beheading. We're talking about psychological torture that would make a modern serial killer jealous. It wasn't just about ending their lives. It was about destroying their dignity, their sanity, and their reputations first. The executioner's axe was often the final, almost merciful blow after months or even years of psychological torment. Take Anne Boleyn, for instance. Before her execution, Henry didn't just decide to kill her. He orchestrated an elaborate theatrical frame-up that was as cruel as it was cunning. The charges against her were so ludicrous: adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, incest, and even plotting to poison the king, that no one in the court truly believed them. But Henry didn't need belief. He needed a narrative. He forced Anne's own musician, Mark Smeaton, to confess under unimaginable torture to having an affair with her. Smeaton's broken confession became the flimsy evidence Henry needed to justify his actions, a grotesque performance for the public, and a chilling message to anyone who dared to question him. But here's the truly sick part. Henry didn't just order her to the block. He made Anne watch. She had to stand there, a silent witness to a horror show of her husband's making, as 5 men, including her own brother, were executed for allegedly sleeping with her. She had to watch them die, knowing she was next, a powerless spectator to the slaughter of innocent people who were caught in the web of her husband's paranoid fantasies. Then there was Catherine Howard, who got it even worse. She was barely a teenager when Henry married her, a young girl thrust into a court filled with spies and whispers. When Henry discovered her past relationships, he didn't just execute her. He was so filled with narcissistic rage and a sense of betrayal that he passed an entire law, the Act of Attainder, making it treason for any woman to marry the king without revealing her entire sexual history. Imagine being so petty, so consumed by your own ego, that you changed the entire legal system of a nation just because your teenage wife wasn't a virgin. Her execution was a foregone conclusion, but the law he created was a chilling legacy, a constant reminder of his personal vendetta against her innocence. But the most insidious weapon Henry wielded was the constant psychological game. He would shower his wives with gifts and affection one day, a charismatic and doting husband, only to completely ignore or threaten them the next. They lived in a constant state of emotional whiplash, never knowing if they were a beloved queen or a soon-to-be executed traitor. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, spent her final years essentially under house arrest, forbidden from seeing her daughter Mary. She was a queen of England, the daughter of the powerful Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, and Henry reduced her to a prisoner in her own country, all while spreading rumors that she was mentally ill. She died alone, possibly poisoned, writing letters to Henry he never even bothered to read. He had made her a ghost in her own kingdom long before she ever took her last breath. And here's something that will blow your mind. Henry actually forced his wives to sign documents agreeing to their own divorces or annulments. Anne of Cleves was so terrified of him, so aware of the fate of Anne Boleyn, that she readily agreed to the fake marriage annulment just to avoid execution. She basically had to pretend their marriage never happened and thank him for the privilege of not being murdered. She spent the rest of her life as the king's beloved sister, a gilded cage of a title, a constant reminder of her complete subservience to his will. Even Jane Seymour, the lucky one who died of natural causes, suffered a tragic fate. She died from complications after giving birth to Henry's only legitimate son, Edward. But Henry, ever a pragmatist when it came to his own desires, was already eyeing up his next wife before Jane's body was even cold. He waited exactly 9 days after her funeral to start planning his next marriage. The man treated human beings like disposable objects. And the worst part is that these women had absolutely no escape. Divorce wasn't an option. Running away meant death, and fighting back meant not just your own execution, but potentially your entire family's destruction. They were trapped in a web of his making, with no way out. His eating habits were absolutely insane. If you think competitive eating is crazy today, wait until you hear about Henry VIII's daily food consumption. This man didn't just eat like a king. He ate like he was trying to single-handedly cause a famine. Henry consumed roughly 5,000 calories per day, and this is a conservative estimate based on historical records. For context, that's more than double what an active adult male should eat. And remember, this guy could barely walk by the end of his life. His daily food intake was the caloric equivalent of a modern professional athlete, yet he was almost completely sedentary. But the sheer quantity wasn't even the weirdest part. It was what he ate and how he ate it. A typical meal for Henry, which was often one of several massive sittings throughout the day, included an entire roasted pig, multiple whole chickens, several types of fish, mountains of bread, and enough wine to float a small boat. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. His kitchen staff prepared over 800 different dishes every single day just for his household, with Henry personally sampling dozens of them. The royal kitchens employed over 200 people working around the clock, roasting, boiling, and baking, to keep up with his monumental appetite. They were a culinary army, constantly in motion to satisfy the whims of one man. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. Henry was convinced that certain foods had magical properties, or at least that they held a certain prestige that only he could possess. He believed that eating swan would make him more graceful, a belief rooted in the bird's regal and elegant appearance. Consuming large amounts of roasted venison would, he believed, make him a better hunter, imbuing him with the strength and cunning of the deer. And of course, oysters were consumed in massive quantities because he was convinced they would enhance his performance with his wives. So he would gorge himself on these specific foods, treating them like a medieval superfood obsession, a frantic attempt to ingest the very qualities he was desperately losing. The man also had the strangest eating rituals. Every single piece of food that entered Henry's mouth was first tasted by multiple servants to check for poison. This was not a quick dip of the spoon. He was so paranoid that he required his food tasters to wait a full 30 minutes after eating before he would touch anything, just to make sure they didn't drop dead from a delayed acting poison. His meals were basically theatrical performances. He would eat in front of hundreds of courtiers, a public spectacle of consumption, and the whole process could take up to 4 hours. Imagine sitting there, a noble at court, watching this massive, rotting king slowly work his way through enough food to feed a small village, all while pretending this was perfectly normal royal behavior, a performance of power and indulgence. You don't learn this in history classes, but Henry actually banned certain foods from his court. Not because they were unhealthy, but because he thought they were beneath his royal status. Common people's food like turnips and barley were literally illegal at his table, even though they probably would have been far better for his health than the mountains of spiced meat, rich pastries, and pure sugar he consumed daily. The truly insane part is that even as his body was literally falling apart from his diet, with his leg ulcers screaming in pain and his waistline expanding beyond human recognition, Henry kept eating more and more. He was convinced that his royal status somehow made him immune to the consequences of his gluttony, a king who believed his divine right extended even to the laws of biology, the paranoia that ruled an empire. Henry VIII's paranoia wasn't just your typical trust no one attitude. This man turned his entire kingdom into a surveillance state that would make modern dictators jealous. By his final years, Henry was so convinced that everyone was plotting against him that he transformed royal life into a living nightmare for everyone around him. The court was no longer a place of gilded luxury and political maneuvering. It was a psychological prison where a single wrong word could mean a trip to the tower. Let's start with his sleeping arrangements. Henry slept with loaded crossbows next to his bed and kept multiple daggers under his pillow. But that wasn't enough for a man so terrified of assassination. He also had armed guards stationed inside his bedroom, watching him sleep all night. Imagine being so consumed by fear that you couldn't even close your eyes without witnesses, your dreams haunted by the thought of a knife in the dark. The guards were not there for comfort, but as a chilling reminder of the constant, invisible threat Henry believed surrounded him. The palace itself became a fortress of paranoia. Henry ordered the construction of secret passages throughout every building he lived in, not for romance or convenience, but so he could escape if assassins came for him. He had peepholes installed in walls so he could spy on his own courtiers, watching their every move and gesture, trying to discern loyalty from betrayal. He even had listening devices hidden in meeting rooms to eavesdrop on private conversations. A man who refused to believe anything said to his face was the truth. But here's where it gets truly insane. Henry created an entire network of spies whose job was to spy on his other spies. He had informants watching his informants, creating this twisted, self-devouring web of surveillance where nobody knew who they could truly trust. Court life became a psychological horror show where saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could literally get you executed. Nobles, servants, and even family members learned to speak in whispers, to constantly look over their shoulders, to betray their closest friends before they themselves could be betrayed. Henry's food paranoia, already demonstrated by his eating rituals, reached absolutely ridiculous levels. Not only did he have multiple food tasters, but he required his meals to be prepared in completely sealed kitchens with armed guards watching every step of the cooking process. The salt, the spices, even the water had to be tested by different people. He was so convinced someone would poison him that eating a simple meal became a military operation, a terrifying performance of trust and suspicion. He even suspected his own children of plotting against him. He had spies watching Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his own daughters, because he was convinced they were planning to overthrow him. These were children, and he treated them like enemy agents in their own home, poisoning their childhoods with a constant cloud of suspicion. His paranoia got so extreme that he started executing people for crimes they hadn't even committed yet. He'd have someone killed because he dreamed they betrayed him, or because someone else suggested they might be disloyal in the future. The Tower of London was constantly full of people whose only crime was existing near Henry while he was in one of his paranoid moods, a place of constant revolving door horror. The truly terrifying part is that Henry's paranoia was so contagious that it infected his entire court. Nobles started spying on each other. Servants betrayed their masters for imaginary rewards. and everyone lived in constant fear that they'd be the next victim of the king's delusional suspicions. Death couldn't even stop the chaos. You'd think Henry VIII's reign of terror would end with his death, right? Wrong. This man was so committed to being a disaster that even his corpse managed to cause absolute mayhem. Let's start with his final weeks. Henry was so massive that he couldn't walk, so his servants had to carry him everywhere using a specially designed chair with pulleys and wheels. But here's the disgusting part. His leg wounds had become so infected that pieces of rotting flesh would literally fall off his body as they moved him. The servants, horrified and gagging, had to follow behind him with cloths to clean up the chunks of decomposing king that dropped onto the palace floors. His death scene was like something out of a horror movie. Henry's body had swollen to such grotesque proportions that his skin was stretched tight and shiny, a bloated, barely recognizable mass. The smell was so overwhelming that even his doctors, who were used to medieval medical horrors, had to leave the room to vomit. When he finally died, nobody wanted to get close enough to officially confirm he was dead, a final testament to the fear and revulsion he inspired. But wait, it gets so much worse. Henry's body was so bloated with gases from internal decomposition that his coffin had to be specially reinforced. They wrapped his corpse in lead sheets and sealed it in multiple wooden boxes, thinking that would contain the mess. They were very, very wrong. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, something absolutely incredible and utterly macabre happened. The coffin literally exploded. The gases from Henry's continuously decomposing body built up so much pressure that the lead lining burst open with a horrifying boom, and rotting royal remains splattered all over the inside of the hearse. The stench was so horrific that the funeral procession had to stop while servants cleaned up the mess with buckets and rags, scrubbing the inside of the carriage that held a king who had so famously believed in his own divine destiny. Here's a detail that will haunt your dreams. Dogs were reportedly seen licking up the remains of Henry VIII that had leaked from his coffin onto the road. The man who claimed to rule by divine right, who had terrorized an empire and demanded absolute power, ended up as dog food on a country highway. Even his burial became a disaster. They had to dig his grave extra wide to accommodate the massive coffin, but the ground kept collapsing because the soil couldn't support the weight of all that lead and rotting flesh. It took multiple attempts just to get the king's remains into the ground and keep them there. A final indignity for a man who had commanded the world to bend to his will. The chaos didn't end there. For years afterward, people reported strange noises and terrible smells coming from Henry's tomb. Some claimed it was his ghost, but historians think it was probably just more gases escaping from his continuously decomposing remains, a haunting echo of his final, miserable decay. You don't learn this in history classes, but Henry's death was so traumatic for everyone involved that several of the servants who handled his body died within weeks, possibly from infections they caught from contact with his rotting corpse, a final, lethal act of his monstrous life. So there you have it, the real Henry VIII. Not the charismatic king of popular culture, but a walking disaster whose own body betrayed him as dramatically as he betrayed everyone around him. A man so consumed by paranoia and gluttony that he turned one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms into his personal horror show. The most powerful man in England became a prisoner of his own decaying body, and even death couldn't end his capacity for causing absolute chaos. His legacy isn't just the Church of England or his 6 wives. It's a masterclass in how absolute power can turn a human being into something genuinely monstrous.